The golden light from the huge crystal chandeliers filled every corner of the Meridian Hotel's grand ballroom. It was like stepping into a fairy tale. The ceiling was so high you had to crane your neck to see the beautiful painted designs up there. Massive marble columns stood like giants around the room, and the floor was so shiny you could see your reflection in it. Tonight was special. This wasn't just any party. It was the biggest charity event of the year in Chicago. Everyone who was anyone would be here. The kind of people you see on magazine covers and in newspaper business sections. They came wearing clothes that cost more than most people make in a year. The women glided across the floor in gowns that sparkled like starlight. Some wore emerald green silk that flowed behind them like water. Others chose deep red velvet or classic black with diamonds that caught the light every time they moved. Their jewelry was real. Not the kind you buy at department stores, but pieces that belonged in museums. Necklaces with stones the size of grapes, earrings that dangled and caught the light, and rings that could blind you if they hit the chandelier light just right. The men looked just as impressive in their perfectly fitted tuxedos. These weren't rental suits from the mall. These were custom made by tailors whose waiting lists stretched for months. Their shoes were Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. Their watches cost more than luxury cars. When they laughed, it was the confident laugh of people who had never worried about paying rent or buying groceries. Servers in crisp black and white uniforms moved between the guests like dancers, carrying silver trays loaded with fancy appetizers. There were tiny portions of caviar on mother-of-pearl spoons, miniature beef Wellington bites that took hours to prepare, and delicate salmon rolls that melted in your mouth. Crystal glasses filled with champagne that cost hundreds of dollars per bottle caught the light as guests reached for them without even thinking about the price. The conversations buzzed with talk of business deals worth millions, vacation homes, in places most people could never afford to visit, and donations to various causes discussed as casually as others might talk about buying coffee. "Oh, I think we'll donate $50,000 this year," one woman said to her friend while adjusting her pearl necklace. "Maybe 100 if the evening goes well." But behind all this glamour, in the narrow service corridors where the guests never went, a different world existed. The walls were plain white, the floors were simple concrete, and the lighting was harsh fluorescent bulbs that hummed constantly. This was where the real work happened, where dozens of hotel employees rushed back and forth to make sure the elegant evening ran perfectly. Maya Rodriguez had been working in these corridors for 3 long years. At 24, she had already learned that life wasn't fair. While the guests in the ballroom worried about which charity to support with their extra money, Maya worried about making rent every month. She worked double shifts whenever she could get them, sometimes staying at the hotel for 16 hours straight, just to earn enough money to help her family. Her parents had come to America from Guatemala when she was just a baby. They had big dreams of building a better life, and for a while things looked promising. Her father got work in construction, and her mother cleaned offices at night. They saved every penny they could and eventually opened a small restaurant in a neighborhood that was still rough around the edges but affordable. The restaurant served the food Maya's mother remembered from her childhood. Warm, hearty meals that reminded people of home. The tamales were wrapped in banana leaves and steamed for hours until they were perfect. The pupusas were made fresh every morning, the masa mixed by hand until it was just right. The smell of cumin, cilantro, and fresh tortillas filled the small space and made everyone who walked in feel welcome. But running a restaurant was harder than they expected. The equipment broke down constantly. The rent kept going up. Competition from bigger chain restaurants made it hard to attract new customers. Maya's parents worked 7 days a week, getting up before dawn and not closing until late at night. Even then, they barely broke even most months. That's why Maya took the job at the Meridian Hotel. Every dollar she earned went straight to her parents to help keep the restaurant alive. She sent them money for new equipment when the old stove finally gave up. She helped pay for the fresh ingredients that made their food special. She even helped with the rent when business was slow. Her own apartment was tiny, just one room with a bed, a small table, and a bathroom she shared with 3 other tenants. She didn't have cable TV or fancy furniture. Her clothes came from thrift stores, and she cut her own hair to save money. But none of that mattered to her as much as helping her family keep their dream alive. Tonight, Maya balanced another heavy tray as she walked through the service corridor toward the ballroom. The tray held delicate glass appetizer plates, each one worth more than she made in a day. She had to be extra careful. Dropping even one would mean the cost would come out of her paycheck. She paused outside the ballroom's service entrance, taking a moment to steady herself. Through the small window in the door, she could see the magnificent scene inside. The guests moved gracefully across the polished floor, their laughter mixing with the soft background music that played from hidden speakers around the room. But what caught Maya's attention most was the piano. It sat in the center of the room like a beautiful black sculpture. It was a Steinway grand piano, the kind that serious musicians dreamed of playing. The surface was so perfectly polished it looked like black glass, reflecting the golden chandelier, light in rippling patterns. Maya had only seen pianos like this in pictures before. At home, growing up, they had an old upright piano that Maya's grandmother had somehow managed to bring with her when she moved to America decades ago. It was scarred and scratched with keys that stuck sometimes and a sound that wasn't quite perfect anymore. But Maya's grandmother had taught her to play on that old piano, and it had been the most precious thing in their small apartment. Her grandmother, Abuela Carmen, had been a piano teacher back in Guatemala. She had studied music at the university, there and had dreams of becoming a concert pianist. But life had other plans. She got married young, had children, and by the time she came to America, those dreams seemed impossible. Instead, she cleaned houses during the day and gave piano lessons to neighborhood children in the evenings for a few extra dollars. But with Maya, it was different. From the time Maya was old enough to reach the keys, Abuela Carmen saw something special in her granddaughter. Maya's small fingers seemed to know exactly where to go. She could hear a melody once and play it back perfectly. More than that, when Maya played, something magical happened. The music didn't just come from her fingers, it seemed to come from somewhere deeper, from her heart. Every day after school, Maya would run to her grandmother's apartment and spend hours at that old piano. She learned scales until her fingers moved automatically. She practiced classical pieces that seemed impossible at first but gradually became second nature. Chopin, Bach, Beethoven, names that most kids her age had never heard of became like old friends to Maya. Abuela Carmen was a strict teacher, but she was also patient and loving. When Maya made mistakes, her grandmother would gently guide her, hands to the right position. When Maya got frustrated with a difficult piece, Abuela Carmen would tell her stories about the composers, how Beethoven wrote his most beautiful music even after he couldn't hear it anymore, how Chopin was homesick for Poland when he wrote his most emotional pieces. Music is not just about hitting the right notes, mija, her grandmother would say in her soft accented English mixed with Spanish. Music is about telling a story. Every piece has something to say. Your job is to listen to what it wants to tell you and then help other people hear that story too. Maya practiced for hours every day. While other kids were watching TV or playing video games, she was learning finger exercises and memorizing complex classical pieces. Her friends at school thought she was a little weird for spending so much time with an old piano, but Maya didn't care. When she sat at those keys, the rest of the world disappeared. All the worries about money, all the stress about her family's struggles, all the uncertainty about the future, it all melted away, leaving just her and the music. By the time she was in high school, Maya could play pieces that impressed even professional musicians. She won several local competitions, and her music teacher begged her to audition for music school. But college was expensive, and Maya's family needed her to work. So instead of pursuing music, she got a job at the hotel to help her parents keep their restaurant running. She told herself it was just temporary, just until her parents got back on their feet, just until the restaurant was more stable, just until they saved enough money for her to maybe go to school later. But 3 years had passed, and Maya was still balancing trays and cleaning hotel rooms, her musical dreams feeling farther away than ever. Still, music never really left her. In quiet moments during her breaks, she would find empty conference rooms in the hotel and play silent scales on the tables, her fingers moving through familiar patterns even without keys. Beneath them. Sometimes, late at night in her tiny apartment, she would play pieces in her head, hearing every note perfectly. The first sign that something was wrong came at 7:30, just 20 minutes before the scheduled piano performance. Maya was refilling water glasses at a table near the back of the ballroom when she heard raised voices coming from the service corridor. Hotel staff members were rushing back and forth with worried expressions, their usual calm professionalism replaced by barely controlled panic. At first, Maya thought maybe there was a problem with the kitchen. Perhaps they had run out of some expensive ingredient, or one of the ovens had broken down. These kinds of small crises happened regularly at big events, and the staff was usually good at handling them quietly without the guests ever knowing anything was wrong. But as the urgent whispers grew louder and more frequent, it became clear that this was something much more serious. Maya caught fragments of conversation as servers hurried past her. Hospital, ambulance, and what are we going to tell them? The worry in their voices was unmistakable. Victoria Brennan, the hotel's events manager, was normally the picture of composure. She was the kind of person who could handle 3 crises at once while still smiling gracefully at important guests. Maya had seen her deal with everything from kitchen fires to demanding celebrities without ever losing her cool. But tonight, Victoria looked like she was about to have a breakdown. Victoria's perfectly styled hair was starting to come loose from its elegant updo as she paced back and forth in the service area, her phone pressed to her ear. Her usually flawless makeup was slightly smudged and her hands were shaking as she frantically dialed number after number. Please, I know it's short notice, but this is an emergency, Maya heard Victoria saying into her phone as she passed by the service entrance. The Children's Hospital Charity Gala. Yes, I know he's your best pianist, but surely. What do you mean he's in London? Can't you? Hello? Hello? The phone had gone dead. Victoria stared at it for a moment, then immediately started dialing another number. Maya could see the desperation in her eyes, the kind of panic that comes when everything you've carefully planned starts falling apart, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Maya learned the full story in pieces, overhearing conversations between staff members as the situation became clearer. The evening's star performer, the renowned classical pianist everyone had come to hear, had been rushed to Northwestern Memorial Hospital just an hour ago. He had been feeling sick all day, thinking it was just nerves before the big performance. But by 7 o'clock he was doubled over with stomach cramps so severe he could barely stand. The paramedics who took him away said it looked like severe food poisoning, possibly from something he had eaten at lunch. He would be fine eventually, but there was no way he would be performing tonight. He was probably going to spend the next few days in the hospital getting fluids through an IV and recovering slowly. For any other event, this might have been disappointing but not catastrophic. The guests would understand, maybe get a partial refund, and life would go on. But tonight was different. This wasn't just a concert, it was a charity fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. The entire evening had been carefully orchestrated to maximize donations, and the piano performance was supposed to be the emotional centerpiece of the night. The way these charity galas worked was like a carefully choreographed dance. First, the guests would enjoy cocktails and appetizers while mingling and getting into a generous mood. Then came dinner, during which speakers would talk about the important work the hospital did and the urgent needs that donations could address. But the real magic was supposed to happen during the musical performance. That's when the mood would shift from social to deeply emotional. Beautiful classical music had a way of opening people's hearts and reminding them of what really mattered in life. As the pianist played pieces that spoke to the soul, the guests would think about the sick children who needed help, about their own good fortune, and about their power to make a difference in the world. Then, while people were still emotionally moved by the music, the auction would begin. Items would be bid on not just for their value, but because people felt inspired to be generous. A vacation package that might normally sell for $5,000 could go for $20,000 when people were feeling emotionally connected to the cause. Without the piano performance, the whole evening would fall flat. Oh, people would still donate. They had come here planning to give money after all. But instead of the record-breaking fundraising night everyone hoped for, it would be just another decent but forgettable charity event. The difference could be hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money that could buy life-saving equipment, fund research, or pay for treatments that desperate families couldn't afford. Victoria understood all of this, which was why she was making call after call, trying to find a replacement pianist who could perform on such short notice. But it was 8 o'clock on a Saturday evening. Most professional musicians already had commitments. The few who might be available were either out of town, didn't know the classical repertoire needed for this kind of event, or simply couldn't be reached on such short notice. "What about recorded music?" suggested James, one of the senior servers who had worked at the hotel for over a decade. "We could play some beautiful classical pieces through the sound system. The guests might not even notice the difference." Victoria shook her head firmly. "These people attend concerts at Symphony Hall regularly. They'll know immediately if it's recorded music. Besides, we've been advertising the live performance for months. Some of these guests bought tickets specifically to hear him play." Another staff member suggested hiring a local wedding musician, someone who played piano at hotels and reception halls around the city. Victoria had already thought of that and made several calls, but the musicians she reached either weren't skilled enough for such a prestigious event or were already booked for other weddings and parties. The clock on the service area wall seemed to tick louder and louder as the minutes passed. At 8:15, the dinner service was supposed to end and the musical portion of the evening would begin. The guests were already finishing their desserts, and some were beginning to look around expectantly, checking their programs and preparing for what they thought would be the highlight of the night. Maya continued working, but she found it impossible to focus on her tasks. She kept thinking about all the sick children who would benefit from the money raised tonight, and how disappointed everyone would be when they learned there would be no performance. She thought about her grandmother, who would have been heartbroken to know that somewhere a beautiful piano was sitting silent when it should have been making music that could touch people's souls and inspire them to help others. As she refilled wine glasses at table 12, Maya overheard Mrs. Harrison, one of the event's main organizers, talking quietly to her husband. "I just don't understand how this could happen," Mrs. Harrison was saying, her voice tight with stress. "We've been planning this event for over a year. Everything was supposed to be perfect." "These things happen, dear," her husband replied, patting her hand gently. "I'm sure Victoria will figure something out." But Maya could see that Mrs. Harrison wasn't convinced. This was her pet project, her chance to make a real difference for the children's hospital that had saved her own grandson's life 5 years earlier. She had worked tirelessly to make this the most successful fundraiser in the hospital's history, and now it felt like everything was falling apart. At another table, Maya heard similar conversations. The guests were beginning to sense that something was wrong. They could see the staff members whispering urgently to each other, could notice the tension in the air even though everyone was trying to maintain a professional demeanor. Victoria made one last desperate phone call to a music agency that specialized in classical performers. Maya could hear her side of the conversation as she passed by the service entrance again. "I understand it's extremely short notice, but this is for the children's hospital. Yes, I know your fee structure, and yes, we can pay double the usual rate." "What do you mean none of your pianists are available? Not even for emergency rates, are you absolutely sure?" When Victoria hung up the phone, her shoulders sagged in defeat. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to compose herself before she would have to go into the ballroom and make the announcement that would disappoint 600 guests and potentially cost the children's hospital hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost donations. Maya felt her heart breaking for Victoria, for the disappointed guests, and most of all for the sick children who needed the money that might not be raised tonight. She had grown up poor herself, had seen what it was like when families couldn't afford medical care. Her own little cousin had once needed surgery that her aunt and uncle couldn't pay for. They had to sell their car, borrow money from relatives, and go into debt that took them years to pay off, all for a procedure that wealthy families wouldn't even think twice about. That's when Maya made a decision that surprised even herself. Her hands. Victoria stared at Maya for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, she weighed every possible outcome, every risk, every consequence of what she was considering. Her career at the Meridian Hotel, her reputation in Chicago's event planning community, and potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars for sick children, all hung in the balance of this impossible decision. "Maya," Victoria said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you absolutely certain you can do this? I need you to understand what's at stake here. If you get up on that stage and can't deliver, it won't just be embarrassing for you. It could be a disaster for everyone involved." Maya's throat felt like sandpaper, but her voice was steady when she replied, "I understand, Mrs. Brennan. I wouldn't have offered if I wasn't sure I could do it. I've been playing these pieces for years. Chopin's Ballade No. 1, Rachmaninoff's Piano, Concerto No. 2, Debussy's Clair de Lune. I know them all by heart." Victoria closed her eyes and made the decision that would either save the evening or end her career. Okay, we're going to do this. But Maya, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you ever performed for an audience this size before? Maya's hesitation was brief but telling. "No, ma'am. The biggest audience I've played for was maybe 50 people at my high school graduation ceremony. But music is music, whether there are 50 people listening or 500. Victoria felt her stomach drop, but there was no turning back now. The clock on the wall showed 8:12. "All right, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to make a brief announcement to buy us some time. I'll tell them there's been a slight delay with the evening's entertainment, maybe offer another round of coffee and dessert wine. That will give us maybe 15 minutes to get you ready." The next few minutes became a blur of frantic activity. Victoria quickly explained the situation to her assistant manager, David, whose eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. "You're going to let one of the servers perform? Victoria, are you out of your mind?" "Probably," Victoria admitted. "But what choice do we have? We can either cancel the performance entirely and watch our fundraising numbers plummet, or we can take a chance on Maya. She seems confident, and right now, confidence is all we've got." While Victoria went into the ballroom to make her announcement, David helped Maya prepare for what might be the most important 15 minutes of her life. The first challenge was finding something appropriate for her to wear. Her server's uniform, while professional, was hardly suitable for a performance at Chicago's most prestigious charity gala. "We need to get you into something that looks like you belong on that stage," David said, thinking quickly. "What size are you?" Maya told him, and David's face lit up with an idea. "I think there's a dress in the hotel's lost and found that might work. It's been there for months. Someone left it after a wedding reception and never came back for it. They hurried to the hotel's lost and found storage room, where David pulled out a simple but elegant black dress. It wasn't fancy enough to compete with the designer gowns worn by the guests, but it was appropriate for a musical performance. The dress fit Maya reasonably well, though it was a bit long, and she had to be careful not to trip over the hem. "Now we need to do something about your hair," David said, studying Maya's appearance critically. "You can't perform looking like you just came from the service corridor." Maya's hair was pulled back in the practical ponytail required of all servers, but David helped her arrange it into a more sophisticated style that would be appropriate for the stage. They didn't have time for professional styling, but David's sister was a hairdresser, and he had picked up enough tips over the years to make Maya look presentable. As they worked to transform Maya's appearance, word spread through the hotel staff about what was happening. Reactions were mixed. Some employees were excited and supportive, whispering words of encouragement and promising to cheer for Maya from the service areas where they could watch. Others were skeptical and worried, convinced that this desperate plan would only make things worse. Carlos, who worked in the kitchen, shook his head when he heard the news. "This is crazy, man. These rich people are going to eat her alive. You don't just walk onto a stage like that without experience." But Maria, one of the housekeeping supervisors who had known Maya for 3 years, disagreed. "You've never heard this girl humming while she works," Maria said. "She's got music in her soul. I think she might surprise everyone." Maya tried to block out both the support and the skepticism as she focused on preparing mentally for the performance. She ran through the pieces in her head, her fingers moving silently as she practiced the difficult passages on an imaginary keyboard. She thought about her grandmother's voice, teaching her that every piece of music told a story. and that her job as a pianist was to help the audience hear that story. Meanwhile, in the ballroom, Victoria was buying time with her announcement. She stood at the podium with a warm smile that hid her inner panic, speaking to the 600 guests who had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I'm afraid we've had a slight technical delay with this evening's musical presentation, but everything will be ready shortly. In the meantime, please enjoy another glass of our signature dessert wine, compliments of the Meridian Hotel." The guests murmured among themselves, but they seemed content to wait. Most were engaged in conversations about the silent auction items that had been displayed around the ballroom, or catching up with friends they hadn't seen in months. A few minutes' delay wasn't unusual at events like this. But Victoria could see some of the more experienced charity gala attendees checking their watches and exchanging knowing glances. These were people who had been to hundreds of similar events over the years, and they could sense when something was wrong. She knew she couldn't buy much more time without people getting suspicious or restless. Back in the service area, Maya was having a quiet crisis of confidence. The reality of what she was about to attempt was beginning to sink in, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold a glass of water steady. "What if I freeze up there?" she asked David, her voice trembling. "What if I get to the piano and my mind just goes blank? What if my hands shake so much I can't hit the right keys?" David, who had initially thought this plan was insane, found himself becoming Maya's biggest supporter. There was something about her determination and the way she talked about the music that convinced him she might actually be able to pull this off. "Listen to me," David said, placing his hands on Maya's shoulders and looking directly into her eyes. "You've been playing piano for 15 years. You know these pieces better than most professional pianists. The only difference between practicing in your apartment and playing in that ballroom is the number of people listening. But the music is the same, the piano is the same, and your talent is the same." Maya nodded, trying to absorb his confidence. You're right, I can do this. I just need to pretend I'm back in Abuela's apartment playing for her like I did when I was little." "Exactly," David encouraged. "And remember, these people aren't your enemies. They're here to support a good cause. They want the evening to be successful just as much as you do. They're not hoping you'll fail. They're hoping you'll succeed." At 8:20, Victoria returned from the ballroom with an update. "Okay, I've bought us a few more minutes, but we need to move soon. The guests are starting to get restless, and I can see some of them checking their phones. Maya, how are you feeling?" Maya took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. "I'm nervous, but I'm ready. I keep thinking about why we're doing this, about all the children who need help from the money we'll raise tonight. If my playing can help them, then it doesn't matter how scared I am." Victoria nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the right attitude. Now let me explain how this is going to work. I'm going to go back in there and introduce you. I won't say much about your background, just that you're a talented pianist who has graciously agreed to perform for us tonight. I'll keep it brief and then turn the stage over to you." "What if they ask questions afterward?" Maya wondered. "Cross that bridge when we come to it," Victoria replied. "Right now, let's just focus on the performance itself. What pieces are you planning to play?" Maya had been thinking about this carefully. "I'll start with Debussy's Clair de Lune. It's beautiful and peaceful, and it will help me settle my nerves. Then I'll move to Chopin's Ballad No. 1. That's more technically challenging and will show that I'm serious about this. I'll finish with the second movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. It's incredibly emotional and should leave the audience in the perfect mood for the fundraising auction." Victoria was impressed by Maya's strategic thinking. "That sounds perfect. The total performance time will be about 20 minutes, which is exactly what we planned. Maya, I have to ask, are you sure you don't want any sheet music up there with you just in case?" Maya shook her head. "I've memorized all of these pieces completely. Having sheet music would actually make me more nervous because I'd be tempted to look at it instead of trusting myself. Besides, I want the audience to see that The moment Victoria opened the ballroom doors, Maya felt like she was stepping into a different world. The warm buzz of conversation that had filled the room just minutes earlier began to fade as guests noticed movement at the main entrance. The crystal chandeliers seemed brighter now, casting everything in sharp detail that made Maya acutely aware of every face turning toward her. Victoria walked confidently to the podium, her professional smile firmly in place despite the chaos of the last 30 minutes. Maya remained near the entrance, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from shaking, watching as 600 of Chicago's most influential people turned their attention to the front of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria's voice rang out clearly through the sound system, "thank you so much for your patience this evening. As you know, we had planned for a very special musical performance to accompany tonight's fundraising efforts for Chicago Children's Hospital." Maya could see the guests settling back in their chairs, preparing to listen to what they assumed would be an introduction of the famous pianist they had come to hear. She watched their faces, some politely attentive, others still engaged in quiet conversations, a few checking their phones one last time before the performance began. "Unfortunately," Victoria continued, "our originally scheduled performer has taken ill and will not be able to join us tonight." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maya could see disappointment flash across many faces, and she watched as some guests began to shift in their seats or glance toward the exits. This was the moment Victoria had been dreading, the point where the evening could fall apart completely. "However," Victoria said, her voice rising slightly to recapture everyone's attention, "we are incredibly fortunate to have with us tonight a remarkably talented pianist who has graciously agreed to perform for us on very short notice." Maya felt her heart hammering against her ribs as Victoria gestured toward her. This was it. There was no turning back now. As she began walking toward the piano, she could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes following her every step. The room was so quiet she could hear her own footsteps on the polished floor, could hear the whisper of her borrowed dress brushing against her legs. As Maya moved through the room, she could hear fragments of whispered conversations from the guests she passed. Some seemed curious and optimistic. How wonderful that someone could fill in on such short notice. Others were more skeptical. Who is this person? I've never heard of her. But it was the looks on people's faces that told the real story. Maya could see confusion in many eyes as guests tried to place her face, to remember where they might have seen her before. A few seemed to recognize her as one of the servers from earlier in the evening, and she watched their expressions change, from curiosity to something approaching disbelief. At table 7, Mrs. Richardson leaned toward her husband with a puzzled frown. "Doesn't she look familiar to you? I think she's the young woman who was serving our appetizers earlier." Mr. Richardson adjusted his glasses and studied Maya more carefully. "You're right, I think she was. How extraordinary. I wonder if she's a music student working part-time at the hotel." Similar conversations were happening at tables throughout the ballroom. The guests were sophisticated enough to keep their voices low, but Maya could feel their assessment as she walked past. These were people who attended symphony performances regularly, who served on the boards of arts organizations, who knew the difference between amateur and professional musicianship. They were trying to figure out who this unknown young woman was and whether she was capable of providing the level of entertainment they had paid premium prices to experience. As Maya approached the piano, she caught sight of some of the hotel staff members who had positioned themselves near the service entrances where they could watch the performance. She saw Maria giving her an encouraging thumbs up, and Carlos, who had been skeptical earlier, watching with intense curiosity. Even some of the kitchen staff had found ways to peek through the service doors to see what would happen. The piano bench seemed miles away, even though Maya knew it was only a few more steps. The magnificent Steinway grand piano looked even more impressive up close, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier light like black water. This was the kind of instrument that Maya had dreamed of playing since she was a child, the kind of piano that could bring out every nuance of a performance, that would respond to the slightest touch with perfect clarity and rich, full sound. But as Maya reached the piano, she made the mistake of looking out at the audience, and what she saw nearly made her turn and run. 600 faces stared back at her, and while some looked curious or encouraging, others showed expressions she had never seen directed at her before: skepticism, doubt, and in a few cases, what looked suspiciously like amusement. At table 12, she could see a group of women who looked like they belonged on the society pages of magazines. Their designer gowns probably cost more than Maya made in a year, and their jewelry caught the light every time they moved. One of them leaned toward her companions and whispered something that made them all glance in Maya's direction with raised eyebrows. Near the front, a distinguished gentleman in an expensive tuxedo was studying Maya with the kind of critical assessment usually reserved for art auctions or wine tastings. He had the look of someone who knew classical music intimately, someone who would notice every wrong note or missed dynamic marking. Maya's hands began to tremble more noticeably as the weight of what she was attempting began to sink in. These weren't just any audience members. These were some of the most cultured and sophisticated people in Chicago. They regularly attended performances at Symphony Hall, supported world-class musicians, and had expectations that Maya wasn't sure she could meet. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her completely. What had she been thinking? How had she imagined that a waitress from a struggling family could perform for people like this? The pieces she knew so well suddenly seemed impossibly difficult, and she couldn't remember how any of them began. But then as Maya sat down at the piano bench and adjusted its height, something magical happened. Her hands naturally fell to the keys, and the familiar feel of the smooth ivory beneath her fingertips brought back a flood of memories and muscle memory that had been building for 15 years. She remembered being 9 years old and sitting at her grandmother's old piano, struggling to reach the pedals while Abuela Carmen patiently guided her through her first simple melodies. She remembered the first time she successfully played a complete Chopin nocturne without mistakes, and the tears of pride in her grandmother's eyes. She remembered countless hours of practice, working through difficult passages again and again until they became second nature. Most importantly, she remembered what her grandmother had always told her. Music is not about impressing people, mija. Music is about sharing something beautiful. When you sit at the piano, you become a bridge between the composer's heart and the listener's heart. Your job is not to be perfect. Your job is to be honest. Maya closed her eyes and took a deep breath, letting the familiar weight of her hands on the keys center her thoughts. When she opened her eyes again, she looked out at the audience differently. Instead of seeing 600 critics waiting to judge her, she saw 600 people who had come here tonight because they cared about helping sick children. They were here because they wanted to make a difference, just like she did. The room had fallen completely silent. Even the servers had stopped moving, and the only sound was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic from the street far below. Maya could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her, but instead of feeling crushed by it, she found herself drawing strength from it. These people had paid significant money to be here tonight. They had dressed up, driven through traffic, and carved time out of their busy lives because they believed in the cause they were supporting. The least Maya could do was give them her absolute best effort. Maya placed her hands in position for the opening measures of Debussy's Clair de Lune and paused for just a moment. In that silence, she made a silent promise to her grandmother's memory, to the sick children who would benefit from tonight's fundraising, and to herself. She would not just play the notes correctly, she would tell the story that each piece of music was meant to tell. The first note that emerged from the piano was soft and pure, floating through the ballroom like a whispered secret. Maya had chosen to begin with Clair de Lune specifically because it was a piece that could establish mood and emotion immediately. The gentle, flowing melody was like a musical invitation, asking the audience to set aside their skepticism and join her on a journey through sound. As Maya continued with the opening phrases of the piece, she could feel the atmosphere in the room beginning to shift. The whispered conversations stopped entirely. The rustling of programs and the clinking of glasses faded away. Even the servers, who had been moving quietly around the edges of the room, stood still to listen. Maya found herself settling into the familiar rhythm of performance. Letting her training and IAs, the applause for Clair de Lune faded. Maya felt a transformation taking place within herself. the nervous energy that had threatened to overwhelm her just minutes earlier was now channeling itself into pure musical focus. She was no longer Maya, the waitress who had stumbled into an impossible situation. She was Maya, the pianist, sharing her gift with people who had come here to help children in need. Without pausing to acknowledge the applause, Maya immediately transitioned into Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. This was a deliberate choice. She wanted to prove that her success with the gentle Debussy piece wasn't just beginner's luck. The Chopin Ballade was one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical piano repertoire, requiring not just perfect finger technique, but deep emotional understanding and the ability to sustain dramatic intensity over nearly 10 minutes. The opening measures of the ballade began quietly, almost hesitantly, like someone beginning to tell a story they're not sure anyone wants to hear. Maya's touch was delicate but confident as she laid out the main theme, a melody that seemed to carry the weight of longing and memory. The beauty of this piece was that it told a complete emotional journey, beginning with uncertainty, building through passion and conflict, and ultimately reaching a resolution that was both triumphant and tinged with sadness. As Maya moved through the first section of the ballad, she could feel the audience settling into a deeper level of attention. This wasn't background music for dinner conversation. This was music that demanded to be heard, that insisted on being felt. The technical passages that had once seemed impossibly difficult to her teenage self now flowed from her fingers with the ease that came from years of dedicated practice. At table 15, Dr. Patricia Wilson, who served on the board of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, leaned forward with growing amazement. She had attended thousands of classical performances over the past 30 years, and she could recognize exceptional talent when she heard it. What surprised her wasn't just Maya's technical skill, but the maturity of her musical interpretation. This young woman wasn't just playing the right notes in the right order. She understood what Chopin was trying to say. "Charles," Dr. Wilson whispered to her husband, "this is extraordinary. Who did they say this young woman was?" Charles Wilson, who had been equally captivated by Maya's performance, shook his head. "They didn't give us much information, but I'll tell you one thing, she's wasted wherever she's been hiding. This is professional level playing." As Maya entered the more dramatic middle section of the ballade, her playing became more powerful and emotionally intense. The Steinway piano responded beautifully to her touch, its rich tone filling every corner of the ballroom with sound that seemed to reach directly into the listeners' hearts. The melody soared and plunged, built to thunderous climaxes and retreated to whispered intimacies, all under Maya's complete control. Victoria, watching from the side of the room, felt tears forming in her eyes, not just from relief that the evening was being saved, but from genuine emotional response to the music. She had organized hundreds of charity events over the years, had heard dozens of professional performers, but she had rarely experienced anything as moving as what Maya was creating on that stage. The hotel staff members who had gathered to watch were equally transfixed. Maria, who had encouraged Maya earlier, was openly crying as she listened to the soaring melodies. Even Carlos, who had been skeptical about the whole plan, was nodding his head in amazement. "I can't believe it," he whispered to David. "She's incredible. How did we not know she could do this?" As Maya approached the final section of the Chopin Ballade, she drew on every technique her grandmother had taught her about building emotional climaxes. The music became more urgent, more passionate, driving toward the dramatic conclusion with an intensity that had the entire audience holding their breath. Her fingers flew over the keys with precision and power, bringing out every nuance of Chopin's complex harmonies and rhythms. The final measures of the ballade came like a thunderclap, with Maya's hands spanning the entire keyboard in powerful chords that seemed to shake the crystal chandeliers above. Then suddenly it was over. The last note faded into silence, and for a moment, the entire ballroom seemed suspended in time. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, then 10. Maya kept her hands poised above the keys, knowing instinctively that the music needed this moment to settle into the listeners' souls before being interrupted by applause. She could feel the emotional weight of what she had just shared hanging in the air like incense. Then the applause began, and it was unlike anything Maya had ever experienced. It didn't start gradually this time. It exploded from every corner of the room simultaneously, as if 600 people had all been holding their breath and released it at exactly the same moment. The sound was thunderous, overwhelming, almost frightening in its intensity. But this wasn't just applause. People were standing up. First one person, then another, then entire tables rising to their feet in recognition of what they had just witnessed. Maya looked out at the sea of faces and saw something she had never seen directed at her before: genuine awe and respect. Mrs. Richardson, who had initially been puzzled by Maya's appearance on the stage, was clapping so enthusiastically that her jewelry was flashing in the chandelier light. "Magnificent," she called out, her voice carrying over the applause. "Absolutely magnificent." At the symphony board table, Dr. Wilson was already pulling out her phone to make notes about this remarkable young performer. She knew talent scouts and music school administrators who needed to hear about Maya immediately. This level of ability belonged in concert halls, not hotel service corridors. But Maya wasn't finished yet. As the applause continued, she raised her hands slightly to indicate that she had one more piece to perform. The crowd gradually settled back into their seats, but the energy in the room had completely transformed. These were no longer skeptical observers wondering if a hotel worker could entertain them. These were devoted music lovers who had just witnessed something special and were eager to hear what came next. For her final piece, Maya had chosen the second movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, adapted for solo piano. This was a strategic choice that went beyond just musical considerations. The Rachmaninoff piece was deeply emotional and romantic, the kind of music that would leave the audience in exactly the right mood for the charity auction that would follow her performance. As Maya began the opening measures of the Rachmaninoff, she felt like she was coming home. This piece had been one of her grandmother's favorites, and Maya had been playing it since she was 16. Every phrase held memories of late afternoon practice sessions in her grandmother's small apartment, of Abuela Carmen's gentle corrections, and enthusiastic praise of the moment when Maya had first been able to play the entire movement without mistakes. The melody that emerged from the piano was like liquid gold, rich and warm, and achingly beautiful. Rachmaninoff had composed this concerto during a period of deep depression, and it carried all the longing and hope of someone fighting their way back toward the light. Maya poured her own experiences into the music, her struggles growing up in a family that never had enough money, her dreams of musical success that had seemed impossible until tonight, her love for her parents and grandmother who had sacrificed so much to give her opportunities. As she played, Maya could see the effect the music was having on her audience. This wasn't just entertainment anymore, it was a shared emotional experience. She could see tears glistening on many faces, could see people reaching for their spouse's hands or leaning closer to their companions. The music was doing what great music always does. It was reminding people of what really mattered in their lives. The Rachmaninoff piece built to several emotional climaxes, each one more powerful than the last. Maya's technique was flawless, but more importantly, her interpretation was deeply personal and authentic. She wasn't trying to impress anyone with technical virtuosity. She was sharing her heart through the music, and the audience could feel the difference. As Maya approached the final section of the piece, she thought about all the sick children who would benefit from the money raised tonight. She thought about families who were struggling to pay medical bills, about parents who stayed up all night worrying about their children's health, about the doctors and nurses who worked tirelessly to save young lives. All of these thoughts flowed into her playing, giving the music an additional layer of meaning and purpose. The final measures of the Rachmaninoff were soft and gentle, like a lullaby or a prayer. Maya let each note speak clearly before moving to the next one, building a sense of peaceful resolution that felt like a blessing being offered to everyone in the room. When she played the last chord, she let it ring until it faded completely into silence, then slowly lifted her hands from the keys. What followed was unlike anything Maya could have imagined. The silence lasted only a fraction of a second before the entire ballroom erupted in the kind of ovation usually reserved for world-renowned artists at major concert halls. Everyone was on their feet immediately, clapping and cheering with an enthusiasm